The Volith Dominion had conquered 312 species across the galaxy, every single one of them had surrendered within hours. It was not a matter of pride for the Volith, it was simply a fact like gravity or the cold of deep space. Species saw the power of the Dominion, and they knelt. That was how the universe worked. Archon Tyrellus stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Talon, and watched the blue and green planet spinning slowly on the main display. It was a pretty world, small, fragile. The dominant species had only recently begun crawling beyond their own atmosphere, planting tiny colonies on their moon and the red planet next door. They had no faster-than-light travel, no energy shields, no plasma weapons. Their most advanced warships were little more than armored cargo haulers with missile tubes bolted to the sides. Primitives, his second-in-command, Subarchon Villon, said with a yawn, "This will be the shortest campaign of the season." Tyrellus agreed, though he did not say so out loud. He had been commanding submission operations for 30 cycles, and he had learned that every species, no matter how strange, followed the same pattern. First came the panic, then the attempts at communication, then the begging, and finally the surrender. The whole process rarely took longer than a single rotation of the target world. He gave the order. A single beam of concentrated plasma lanced down from the Eternal Talon and struck the largest desert on the planet's surface. The beam held for 11 seconds. When it faded, a trench of molten glass stretched 90 km across the sand, glowing white-hot and visible from orbit. The heat pulse sent shockwaves rippling outward. Dust storms erupted. Satellites captured every moment. Tyrellus clasped his clawed hands behind his back and settled into his command chair. "Begin the timer," he said calmly. "Record the species designation as Target 313. Note the timestamp of the submission. Pulse, we will have their surrender before the planet completes its next rotation." He was so certain of this that he ordered his officers to begin preparing standard occupation documents, resource extraction schedules, population management protocols, the usual paperwork of empire. Down on the surface of the planet, the world called Earth, things were not going according to his expectations. The trench in the Sahara Desert killed no one directly. It was a remote stretch of sand and rock, far from any major city, but the shockwave carried it, shattered windows in villages 200 km away. It threw dust into the atmosphere that darkened skies across North Africa, and the heat signature was detected by every military satellite in orbit within seconds. Within minutes, every government on Earth knew what had happened. Within an hour, the footage was everywhere, shaky camera recordings of the sky splitting open, satellite images of the glowing wound in the desert, telescope feeds showing the cluster of alien warships hanging near Jupiter like a flock of dark birds. The world did not react the way the Valith expected. There was fear, certainly. There was chaos in some cities, panic buying, prayers in temples and churches and mosques, but underneath all of that, rising like heat from summer pavement, there was something else, something the Valith had never encountered in 312 conquests. Rage. The United Terran Coalition, the fragile, often bickering governing body that loosely connected Earth, Luna, Mars, and the belt stations, called an emergency session. Representatives from every nation and colony joined by secure channel, the Snort's arguments were loud, the accusations were sharp, but they were not arguments about whether to surrender. Nobody even suggested it. The arguments were about how to fight back and who would lead. The session lasted 4 hours. In the end, the vote was unanimous: full wartime authority was granted to Admiral Rhea Akinquo, a tall, steady-eyed woman who had spent her career commanding peacekeeping operations on Mars and had never lost a battle she chose to fight. She stood before the assembly, some present in person, most appearing as holographic projections, and she did not waste words. She was not a woman who made speeches. She looked at the faces of the people who had just handed her the survival of the human race, and she said. They introduced themselves with fire. We will answer in kind. This session is over. Go to your stations. The room emptied in minutes. Across human space, the machinery of war began to turn. On Earth, the old military factories, many of them converted to civilian manufacturing decades ago, received emergency orders. Assembly lines that had been producing agricultural equipment and construction vehicles were retooled overnight. Engineers who had designed mining ships were told to make weapons. Scientists who had studied the stars for knowledge were told to study them for weakness. On the moon, Luna Command became the nerve center of the defense. Clear's throat effort. The orbital stations around Earth were reinforced with whatever was available: extra armor, plating, civilian shuttle engines, even repurposed satellite dishes turned into crude targeting arrays. In the asteroid belt, the miners and haulers and station workers heard the news and reacted with a particular fury of people who live hard lives in hard places. They had built their communities with their own hands in the vacuum of space, and they were not about to let some alien empire take it away. Belt captains began welding rail guns onto cargo ships. Mining charges were reconfigured into missiles. Electromagnetic launchers designed to throw ore containers across the solar system were recalibrated to throw something far more dangerous. And on Titan, in a research station that officially did not exist, a message arrived with the highest possible security clearance. The station commander read it, locked it in her personal safe, and called her team together. The Black Fleet is active, she told them. Prep everything. We launch in 72 hours. Back near Jupiter, Archon Tielas waited. The timer on his display counted the hours. The planet's rotation came and went. No surrender signal arrived. He waited longer, still nothing. His communications officer reported that the planet was broadcasting enormous amounts of electromagnetic noise, but none of it matched any known surrender protocol. In fact, none of it matched any protocol at all. It was a wall of overlapping signals in thousands of different formats. What are they saying? Tielas asked. The communications officer worked for several minutes, then looked up with an expression that Tielas had never seen on a Valeth face before. I am not entirely certain, Archon, the officer said slowly, but I believe they are angry. Tielas stared at the blue planet on his screen. In 30 years of conquest, he had seen fear, despair, confusion, and resignation. He had never once seen anger. He did not know what to do with it. He decided to wait a little longer. Surely they would come to their senses. They did not. 72 hours passed after the beam struck the Sahara, and Archon Tayela began to feel something unfamiliar sitting in his stomach. It was not fear. Valeth commanders did not feel fear. It was more like the feeling of stepping onto solid ground and finding it soft beneath his feet. Every species he had ever conquered sent a surrender signal within 8 hours. Most sent one within 3. The fastest had been a race of gentle, six-limbed creatures on a water world near the galactic core. They had surrendered 11 minutes after the submission pulse so quickly that Tayela suspected they had been drafting the message before the beam even hit. But the humans had sent nothing, no plea for mercy, no request for terms, no diplomatic channel, nothing. Perhaps their communication technology is too primitive, subarchon viral suggested on the 3rd morning. Perhaps they do not know how to reach us. Tayela shook his head. They can see us. Their detection systems have been tracking the fleet since we arrived. They know we are here. They are choosing not to speak. He ordered his cultural analysts to study the electromagnetic signals pouring from the planet. The analysts worked for a full day and came back looking exhausted and confused. The species they reported did not have a single language, they thousands. They did not have a single government. They had hundreds. Their media broadcasts contained simultaneous reports of panic, military mobilization, religious ceremonies, something called comedy shows, and what appeared to be competitive athletic events that had not been canceled despite the alien invasion. They are still playing games, Tayela asked, certain he had misunderstood. It appears so, Archon, and their attendance numbers have actually increased. Tayela stared at the report for a long time and said nothing, while the Archon tried to understand. Humanity from orbit, Admiral Rhea Akonquo was not wasting a single second. She had set up her command center in the deep bunkers beneath Luna Command, surrounded by holographic displays that showed every ship, every station, and every asset in human space. She had slept 4 hours in the last 3 days, sustained by coffee and a cold, focused anger that she kept locked behind her calm exterior. Her battle plan was unusual. Every officer she briefed said so, some more politely than others. Standard military thinking said you gathered your forces together and presented a united front. Akonquo did the opposite. She split humanity's response into 3 separate forces, each with a different mission, each operating independently. The first was the Earth Defense Grid. Every orbital station, satellite weapon, and combat-capable ship within Earth and Luna's sphere of influence. It was the most conventional force, and its job was simple: hold the line around Earth no matter the cost. The second was the Belt Fleet. This was the force that made her officers nervous. The Belt colonies had no warships. What they had were mining vessels, cargo haulers, ore processors, and the rough, resourceful people who operated them. Akonquo had ordered every Belt captain willing to fight to arm their ships with whatever they could find and form up at a rally point hidden in the asteroid field. It was not a proper navy. It was a mob with rail guns. But it was a mob that knew how to operate in deep space, and it would come from a direction the Vaith were not watching. The third was the Black Fleet from Titan. Experimental ships running on drives that the public did not know existed, carrying weapons that had never been tested in combat. Akonquo had received a brief technical summary of their capabilities and had read it 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. If the summary was accurate, the Black Fleet could change the shape of the battle. If it was wrong, she would need a new plan. She chose to believe the summary. In the asteroid belt, a young engineer named Cale Marin was not sleeping either. He stood in the cargo bay of a converted ore hauler called the Rusty Saw, welding a magnetic accelerator rail to the ship's forward hull. His hands were burned and his eyes were red and his back ached from 12 hours of continuous work, but he did not stop. Cale was 26 years old. He had been born on Ceres Station, raised in the low gravity of the belt, and had spent his adult life building and repairing the machines that kept the asteroid colonies running. He had never held a weapon. He had never been in a fight. He was by every measure a civilian. But his grandmother had lived in a small town in Algeria on the edge of the Sahara. She had refused to leave Earth when the rest of the family moved to the belt, saying she was too old to learn to live without a sky. She had been 230 km from the point of impact. The shockwave had collapsed her house. She had not survived. Cale had received the news 18 hours after the submission pulse. He had stood very still for a long time, alone in his workshop on Ceres, staring at the wall. Then he had picked up his welding torch, walked to the docking bay, and begun turning the rusty saw into a weapon. He was not the only one. Across the belt, hundreds of ships were being modified in the same way. Mining charges became proximity mines, electromagnetic launchers designed to throw 100-ton ore containers were recalibrated to throw 10-ton tungsten slugs at terrifying velocities. Navigation computers built to calculate safe shipping routes were reprogrammed to calculate firing solutions. It was crude, it was ugly. It was the work of angry, grieving people with welding torches and a very basic understanding of weapons engineering. But it was also the work of people who had spent their lives solving impossible problems with inadequate tools in the most hostile environment humans had ever inhabited. If anyone could turn a cargo ship into a warship in 48 hours, it was a belt miner. While the fleets prepared, Dr. Lien Zhao and her team of linguists and signals experts worked in a cramped lab beneath the University of Beijing, racing to decode the alien transmissions. Zhao was a small, sharp-eyed woman with a gift for pattern recognition and a stubbornness that her colleagues described as terrifying. She had been working without rest since the first alien signal was detected, and she had made a breakthrough. The Valeth ultimatum, once decoded, was shockingly simple. It was not a negotiation. It was not a demand. It was a notification, the same notification they had sent to every species they had ever conquered. It said in effect, you have been claimed, submit or be destroyed. But the truly chilling discovery came when Zhao dug deeper into the transmission protocols. The Valeth had attached a data file to their ultimatum, a record of every previous conquest, presumably meant to demonstrate the hopelessness of resistance. 312 species, 312 submission pulses, 312 surrenders. Not a single species had ever fought back, not one. Zhao presented her findings to Admiral Akinquo in a secure briefing. The room was silent when she finished. Then Akinquo leaned forward and said, "Send them our answer." The transmission that went out from Luna Command 12 hours later was not a surrender. It was not a negotiation. It was a formal declaration of war, written in every human language, all 6,000 of them, broadcast on every frequency the Veileth were known to monitor. Behind the words, the transmission carried a sound file. The national anthems of every nation on Earth played simultaneously, layered into a roaring, chaotic wall of music and defiance. On the bridge of the Eternal Talon, the communications officer played the transmission and then stood in stunned silence. The sound filled the bridge, drums and horns and strings and voices, hundreds of melodies crashing against each other in beautiful, furious disorder. Archon Tyrellis listened. His officers listened. None of them moved. "What does it mean?" Tyrellis finally asked. The communications officer swallowed hard. "I have cross-referenced the signal structure with their cultural database Archon. Each individual sound pattern corresponds to a separate political entity on the planet. And the words, they are all saying the same thing. Archon in different languages in different ways, but the meaning is identical across every version." The officer paused. "They are declaring war on us, all of them, every single group on the planet simultaneously." The bridge was silent for a very long time. Taelis turned back to the display, showing the small blue planet, and for the first time in his long career, he ordered his fleet to raise its shields. On the 5th day after the submission, Pulse Archon Taelis made his first tactical decision regarding the human species. He sent 12 warships toward Earth to establish orbital control and begin what the Veileth military handbook called pacification operations. It was a standard move. The warships would position themselves above major population centers, demonstrate their firepower against military targets, and wait for local leaders to begin surrendering one by one. The 12 ships moved inward from Jupiter in a standard arrowhead formation, their shields at half power. There was no reason to waste energy on full shields against a species that had no real weapons. The Veileth captains were relaxed. Some of them had done this a dozen times before. One of them was reportedly eating his midday meal when the alarms began screaming. The first sign of trouble was a cloud of small objects rising from Earth's orbit, hundreds of them moving fast on unpredictable paths. The Veileth sensors classified them as debris. They were not debris. They were civilian satellites that had been stripped of their instruments and packed with explosives, guided by remote operators sitting in bunkers across 6 continents. The explosive satellites were too small and too numerous for the Veileth point defense systems to track effectively. Most of them were destroyed before reaching the warships, but dozens got through, slamming into shields and hulls in rapid succession. The damage was minor dents and scratches on ships designed to withstand plasma fire, but psychological effect was immediate. The Veileth captains suddenly realized that the space around Earth was not empty. It was a trap. The second wave came from the orbital defense grid, repurposed laser arrays, missile platforms bolted to space stations, and armed shuttles opened fire simultaneously from multiple angles. The Veileth shields held against most of the attacks, but the sheer volume of fire forced the warships to slow their advance and raise shields to full power. And then the third wave arrived. Admiral Akinquo had positioned her best combat-capable ships behind the moon, hidden from Veilith sensors by the lunar mass. 28 human warships, the largest and most heavily armed vessels in the UTC fleet, came around the moon's edge in a tight formation and hit the Veilith detachment. From the flank, human ships were smaller, slower, and weaker than Veilith warships. Their weapons could barely scratch Veilith shields under normal circumstances, but Akinquo had studied the sensor data from the first 5 days carefully, and she had noticed something. The Veilith shields flickered for a fraction of a second each time they absorbed a hit. If you timed your shots to land during that flicker, the next round would strike the hull directly. It required impossible precision. Human targeting computers were not fast enough, so while Akinquo had asked for volunteers, gunners willing to fire manually, timing their shots by eye and instinct rather than computer calculation, she got more volunteers than she had guns. The flanking attack crippled 3 Veilith warships in the first 90 seconds. One lost its engines, one lost its main weapon array, the third suffered a hull breach that forced it to withdraw. The remaining 9 ships broke formation, suddenly fighting a battle they had not prepared for. The Veilith were not bad soldiers. They were in fact extremely well trained and well equipped, but their training was built on 3 centuries of fighting enemies who were already beaten before the battle started. They had protocols for accepting surrenders. They had protocols for managing frightened populations. They did not have protocols for an enemy that flew damaged ships directly into their formation and detonated them at point-blank range. 2 human destroyers, their engines crippled and their crews evacuated, were piloted by skeleton crews of volunteers on a collision course with a Veilith heavy cruiser. The first destroyer was destroyed by point defense fire. The second struck the cruiser's shield at full speed, and the impact combined with the synchronized fire from 6 other human ships targeting the shield. Flicker punched through the cruiser's hull, cracked open like an egg. Atmosphere vented into space. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut. The cruiser tumbled powerless out of the fight. On the bridge of the Eternal Talon, still positioned near Jupiter, Archon Tyrellis watched the battle unfold on his tactical display and felt something cold settle into his chest. "They are ramming our ships, Subharkin," Verred said, his voice strange. "They are deliberately crashing their own vessels into ours." "I can see that," Teola Ehrenreich replied quietly. "That is Archon, that is insane. Those crews are dying." "I can see that as well." Then the Belt Fleet arrived. Kale Marin had not slept in 5 days. He stood at the firing controls of the rusty saw, his hands wrapped in bandages. From welding burns, his eyes locked on the targeting display. Around him, 240 belt ships dropped out of their hiding places in the asteroid field and accelerated toward the battle. On emergency thrust, the Belt Fleet did not look like a military force. The ships were mismatched, ugly, scarred by years of hard use in the asteroid mines. Some of them still had mining company logos painted on their hulls. They flew in a loose swarm rather than a proper formation because none of their captains had ever been trained in fleet tactics. But they carried the electromagnetic launchers, and those launchers carried tungsten slugs, dense, heavy rods of metal that had been designed to move asteroid ore across millions of Kilometers. The slugs had no guidance systems. They had no warheads. They were simply very large, very heavy objects traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The first volley of slugs hit the Valith formation from an angle that their sensors had not been monitoring. The slugs moved too fast for shields to fully absorb. A Valith cruiser took a direct hit amidships, and the slug passed through it like a needle through cloth, entering through the port side and exiting through the starboard side. The ship split apart along the wound, breaking into two spinning halves that trailed fire and debris. Two more ships were struck. One lost its entire forward section. The other was hit in the engine block and was left drifting, powerless and dark. Cale fired the rusty Psalms launcher and watched the slug streak away into the black. He did not know if it hit anything. He did not have time to check. He was already reloading, a process that involved 3 people physically manhandling a 2-ton tungsten rod into the magnetic chamber while the ship shook around them. The battle became chaos. The Valith were now fighting on 3 fronts: the orbital grid in front of them, the UTC fleet on their flank, and the Belt Swarm behind them. Their superior technology still gave them an enormous advantage. Human ships were being destroyed at a terrible rate. For every Valith ship crippled, a dozen human vessels were lost. The space around Earth filled with wreckage and emergency beacons and the silent, tumbling bodies of the dead. But the humans did not stop. When a ship was damaged, its crew kept fighting until the ship broke apart around them. When a weapon was destroyed, the crew found another weapon. When there were no weapons left, they pointed their ships at the enemy and flew straight at them. The Valith had never encountered anything like this. Their commanders began making mistakes, pulling back when they should have pushed forward, hesitating when they should have fired. The certainty that had carried them through 300 conquests was cracking. Then the Black Fleet arrived from Titan. There were only 9 ships, sleek and dark and moving with an eerie smoothness that looked wrong compared to the stuttering thrust of normal spacecraft. They carried weapons that the Valith had never seen, disruption fields that reached out like invisible hands and pulled at the energy patterns holding Valorith shields together. Where the disruption fields touched, shields flickered and died. The Black Fleet did not win the battle. By itself, 9 ships could not defeat a Valorith war fleet, but they changed the equation. Suddenly the Valorith shields, the one advantage that had kept them dominant, were unreliable. Suddenly, every human weapon was a threat. Argentile has watched 3 more of his ships die in the space of 10 minutes and made a decision that no Valorith commander had made in the history of the Dominion. He ordered a full retreat. The remaining Valorith ships pulled back to Jupiter, battered and bleeding light from a dozen hull breaches. Behind them, the space around Earth was a graveyard of wreckage from both sides. Humanity had lost 41 ships and over 6,000 lives. The cost was staggering. But they had held. The Valorith had come to take their world, and they had been pushed back. Cale Marin floated in the damaged cockpit of the Rusty Saw, a piece of shrapnel embedded in his left shoulder, blood drifting in small red spheres in the zero gravity. Through the cracked canopy he watched the Valorith engines flare blue as they retreated. The footage reached Earth within minutes. It spread across every screen and every channel on the planet. People watched the alien warships running in. They screamed and cried and held each other in belt stations and lunar habitats in Martian colonies. The reaction was the same. They had bled for it, they had paid a terrible price. But for the first time in galactic history, a species targeted by the Valorith Dominion had punched back, and the Dominion had flinched. Admiral Akinquo allowed herself 1 hour to grieve the dead. She sat alone in her quarters beneath Luna Command, read through the casualty lists, and let the weight of 6,000 names press down on her shoulders. Then she stood up, washed her face, and walked back into the command center. The celebration on Earth was premature. She knew that the first battle had been a victory, but it was the kind of victory that comes at a cost you cannot afford to pay twice. 41 ships lost. Third of the orbital defense grid destroyed. Ammunition reserves already running low. And according to Dr. Zhao's analysis of Volith communication patterns, a reinforcement fleet was on its way, one far larger than the 40 ships already sitting near Jupiter. How many? Akinquo asked during the morning briefing. 200 warships, Admiral, Zhao replied. Based on the signal traffic, they departed from a Dominion staging area approximately 9 days ago. Estimated arrival 23 days. The room went quiet. They had barely survived 40 ships. 200 would end them. Akinquo looked at the faces around the table, tired, injured, frightened people who had just fought the first battle of their lives, and she made a decision. We cannot win the next fight with weapons alone. We need to change the shape of the war before those ships arrive. This was the moment the war shifted from a military campaign to something much larger, and it began with Dr. Lion Zhao's discovery of the lattice. The lattice was the Volith Dominion's galactic communication network, a vast web of relay stations that carried signals between every world under Volith control. It was encrypted, but the encryption was old. The Volith had not updated it in over a century because they had never needed to. No conquered species had ever tried to hack it. No conquered species had ever tried to do anything except obey. Zhao's team cracked it in 6 days. The encryption, she explained to Akinquo, was like a lock on a door in a neighborhood where no one had ever heard of theft. It was strong enough to keep out accidents, but not designed to resist a determined attack. And humanity, Zhao said with a thin smile, was very determined. What they found inside the lattice changed everything. The network carried standard military and administrative traffic, supply orders, garrison reports, tax collection data. But it also carried something else, buried in the background, noise like whispers beneath a shout, private signals, hidden frequencies, secret communications between members of conquered species who had been living under Valith rule for centuries. The Valith had not destroyed the cultures they conquered. That would have required effort they did not feel was necessary. Instead, they had simply layered their own authority on top, confident that submission was permanent. Once given, in most cases they were right, but in some cases, deep beneath the surface of obedience, the old identities survived. Zhao's team found resistant cells on dozens of worlds. They were small, careful, and had been waiting for generations, not for a specific signal, but for any sign that the Dominion was not invincible. Any crack in the wall, any proof that the masters could bleed. Akinquo saw the opportunity immediately. Send them the battle footage, she ordered. Everything, the Belt Fleet. Charging the ramming attacks, the Valeth retreat, send it all and attach. Message. Zhao looked up from her console. What should the message say? Akinquo thought for a moment. Keep it simple, say we fought back, you can too. The transmission went out across the lattice on the 14th day after the submission pulse. It was a compressed data package containing video of the battle, the declaration of war in all human languages, and Akinquo's message translated into every conquered species language that Zhao's team had been able to decode. It was sent to every hidden frequency, every resistance channel, every buried whisper in the network. The effect was not immediate. It could not be. These were species that had been subjugated for centuries, their will to fight long since ground down by the weight of Valeth authority, but the footage was undeniable, a primitive young species with crude weapons and fragile ships had stood against the Dominion and survived. The masters had retreated, their ships had burned. On a water world called Rithasa, the ruling council of the Rithani, an aquatic species of brilliant tacticians who had been conquered 400 years earlier, watched the footage in their deep ocean chambers. They had spent generations studying Valeth military doctrine, cataloging weaknesses, preparing plans that they never believed they would use. The eldest counselor, a scarred and ancient being with faded blue scales, watched a belt mining ship split, a Valeth cruiser with a tungsten slug, and for the first time in her long life she laughed. On a rocky moon in a distant system, they Gelic silicon-based engineers whose understanding of energy systems far surpassed the Valeth received the transmission in their underground workshops. They had been building Valeth technology for centuries, maintaining the Empire's ships and stations and weapons. They knew every system, every circuit, every flaw, and they knew a secret they had kept hidden for 200 years. The Valeth shield generators had a harmonic weakness. A specific frequency applied at the right moment would cause the shields to collapse entirely. They had never shared this knowledge because there had never been anyone to share it with until now. On a gas giant's floating station, the Uma, a hive mind species that experienced reality as a shared consciousness, felt the transmission ripple through their collective awareness. They were the Dominion's communication specialists, forced to maintain the very lattice that now carried humanity's message of defiance. They could not fight with weapons, but they could do something equally dangerous. They could ensure that every resistance cell on every conquered world receive the footage clearly and without interference, and that the Valeth never detected the transmission. These three species made contact with humanity through the lattice within days. The conversations were difficult. Translation was imperfect, cultural gaps were enormous, and trust was a fragile thing between strangers separated by light years. But they shared a common understanding. The Dominion could be challenged, and this was the moment to act. The Rithani shared their tactical analyses of Valeth fleet formations, revealing patterns and habits that human commanders could exploit. The Uma provided real-time intelligence on Valeth fleet movements using their position inside the communication network to track every ship in the Dominion, and the Jellics shared their greatest secret, the shield harmonic frequency. Kale Marin, recovering from his injuries in a medical bay on Siri Station, was pulled out of his hospital bed by a priority message from Admiral Akinkwo's office. He was assigned to a new project, working with Jellic engineers, communicating through the lattice with a translation delay of several minutes to integrate the shield-breaking frequency into human weapons. The collaboration was strange and wonderful. The Jellic thought in mathematical structures that Kale could barely follow, and they communicated through chemical formulas that had to be translated into words and then translated again into engineering specifications. But they were patient teachers, and Kale was a fast learner, and in the gaps between technical discussions, they talked. The Jellic had a dry, dark sense of humor that reminded Kale of the Belt miners he had grown up with. They made jokes about the Volith that Kale suspected would get them executed if overheard. While the weapons project advanced, the broader effects of humanity's lattice broadcast continued to spread. On 17 Volith-occupied worlds, resistance movements that had been dormant for generations began to stir. Supply depots were sabotaged. Communication relays were disrupted. Garrison commanders who had spent comfortable years managing peaceful populations suddenly found themselves dealing with coordinated acts of defiance. The Volith High Command receiving reports of unrest across their territory was forced to make a painful choice. The reinforcement fleet of 200 warships, already en route to Earth, was diverted. Ships were pulled away to deal with uprisings on critical worlds. By the time the fleet reorganized, it had been reduced from 200 ships to 80. Archon Tyrellis received the updated fleet count in his quarters aboard the Eternal Talon and stared at the number. For a long time, 80 ships was still a formidable force, more than enough to overwhelm the battered human defenses, especially after the losses they had taken in the first battle. But for the first time in his career, Tyrellis felt the ground shifting beneath him. The humans had not just fought back, they had reached out across the galaxy and found allies that the Dominion had forgotten were capable of resistance. They had turned a simple conquest into something much more dangerous. He stood at his viewport and watched the distant blue dot of Earth, and he allowed himself to think the thought that had been growing in the back of his mind for days. The thought that no Valith commander had ever needed to think before. What if 80 ships is not enough? On the 30th day after the submission, Pulse, the Valith reinforcement fleet, dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Near Saturn, 80 warships, fresh and fully armed, joined Archon Tyrellis's remaining forces. The combined fleet numbered just over 100 combat vessels, smaller than originally planned, but still the largest concentration of Valith military power deployed against a single species in living memory. Tyrellis stood on the bridge of the Eternal and addressed his captains through the fleet communication channel. He did not deliver a rousing speech. He was not that kind of commander. He simply told them the truth. The species they were about to fight was unlike anything the Dominion had faced before. They were crude, disorganized, and technologically inferior. They were also fearless, unpredictable, and willing to die in ways that made no rational sense. He told his captains to expect the unexpected, to keep their shields at maximum, and to show no hesitation. Then he gave the order to advance. The fleet moved inward from Saturn in a broad crescent formation, sweeping through the outer solar system like a net being drawn closed. Valeth scouts reported the positions of human defense forces, the rebuilt orbital grid around Earth, the Belt Fleet regrouping near the asteroid field, and the small black fleet holding position behind the moon. The human forces were outnumbered, roughly 4-1. Admiral Akinquo watched the Valeth approach from the holographic display in Luna Command. She had not slept in 2 days. The plans she had drawn up over the past 3 weeks were spread across every screen around her fleet. Positions, firing patterns, timing sequences, contingency plans for a dozen different scenarios. She had run simulations until the numbers blurred together. She knew with the cold clarity of a career military officer that the simulations were not encouraging. 80 fresh warships plus tirelesses survivors gave the Valeth overwhelming firepower, even with the shield-breaking frequency, even with the intelligence from the Rithani and the Uma. Humanity did not have enough ships to match them in a straight fight. So Akinquo had designed a battle that would not be a straight fight. Her plan depended on 3 things happening in the correct order. If any one of them failed, the battle was lost, and Earth would fall. She had not shared this assessment with anyone. There was no point in burdening people with mathematics when they needed courage. The first element was the orbital grid. Akinquo had spent 3 weeks not just rebuilding it but expanding it, using every piece of debris and spare material in Earth orbit. From the outside it looked like a desperate, scattered defense. Satellites and platforms spread thin across a wide area. It was meant to look that way. In reality, the grid had been arranged in a specific geometric pattern designed by Rithani tacticians, calculated to funnel an attacking fleet into a narrow corridor where their numerical advantage would be compressed and their formation would be forced to tighten. The Valeth fleet hit the orbital grid and immediately began destroying the outer stations, just as Akinquo expected. The stations were expendable. Many of them were empty, automated platforms firing on preset patterns. Their purpose was not to inflict damage, but to shape the battlefield, pushing the Valeth fleet inward along the corridor like water flowing through channel. Tayela has noticed the pattern after 20 minutes. He was too experienced to miss it entirely, but by the time he ordered his fleet to spread out, the second element of Akinquo's plan activated. The Belt Fleet came out of the asteroid field. 312 ships, more than double the number that had fought in the first battle. In the weeks since the first engagement, every mining vessel, cargo hauler, and transport ship in the belt had been armed and crewed. They were still ugly, still mismatched, still flying in the loose swarm that passed for belt formation discipline, but this time they carried upgraded weapons. The electromagnetic launchers had been refined with jellied engineering principles, giving them better accuracy and faster reload times, and every ship in the fleet carried a new weapon system, the harmonic disruptors. Kale Marin stood at the weapons console of a new ship. The rusty Psalm had been too damaged to repair, so he had been assigned to a converted ice hauler called the Long Goodbye. His shoulder still ached where the shrapnel had been removed, but his hands were steady. Mounted beneath his console was a small device that looked like a tuning fork. Made of crystal, the harmonic disruptor, built to Jellick's specifications in a belt workshop using materials that were never meant for weapons manufacturing. The belt fleet hit the Valeth formation from behind just as it had in the first battle. But this time, instead of opening tungsten slugs, they opened with the disruptors. The effect was immediate and devastating across the Valeth fleet. Shields flickered, distorted, and collapsed. The harmonic frequency tore through the shield generators like a specific note shattering glass. For the first time in the history of the Valeth Dominion, an entire war fleet was stripped of its primary defense in a single coordinated strike. The Valeth warships were still enormously powerful without their shields. Their armor was thick, their weapons were devastating, and their crews were well trained, but they had been built to fight behind shields. Their tactics assumed shields, their confidence depended on shields, and in the terrible seconds after the shields fell, that confidence shattered. Okonkwo gave the order, and every human weapon in the solar system fired at once. The Black Fleet came around the moon and struck the Valeth center. The Belt Fleet hammered them from behind. The orbital grid, its true weapons now revealed. Heavy plasma cannons hidden inside the expendable stations fired from above and below. The UTC warships, held in reserve until this moment, charged from their positions behind Mars and hit the Valeth flanks. The battle became a furnace. Valeth ships, naked without their shields, took hits that would have been harmless minutes before. Human missiles struck armor plating. Tungsten slugs punched through holes. Plasma rounds from the hidden grid cannons carved through engine blocks and weapon arrays. The Valeth fought back with fury. Their weapons were still superior, and they destroyed human ships with terrible efficiency. The space around Earth filled with fire and debris, and the silent flashes of ships dying. The casualty count on both sides climbed with sickening speed. But the Valeth were losing. They were losing because they had never learned how to fight from behind. Every battle in their history had been a display of dominance, a ritual of power where the outcome was never in doubt. Now, for the first time, the outcome was very much in doubt, and they did not know how to respond. Captains made conflicting decisions. Ships broke formation to protect themselves. The fleet's coordination collapsed into a collection of individual ships fighting individual battles, and in that chaos the humans thrived. Kale fired the long goodbyes launcher again and again, sending slugs into the drifting hulk of a Valeth destroyer. Around him, belt ships swarmed over damaged Valeth vessels like wolves around wounded prey, pouring fire into every crack and weakness. It was not elegant, it was not pretty, but it worked. On the Eternal Talon, Archon Tyreles watched his fleet come apart. He had lost 30 ships in the first hour. Another 20 were damaged beyond combat effectiveness. His remaining forces were scattered, their formation gone, their shields useless. The battle was lost, and he knew it. He could have ordered a self-destruct. Vaith tradition demanded it of defeated commanders, a final act of defiance that preserved honor and denied the enemy the satisfaction of capture. Tyle has considered it. He stood at his command console, his clawed hand hovering over the destruct sequence, and he thought about 300 years of Vaith. Dominance built on the idea that resistance was impossible. He thought about the small blue planet that had proven that idea wrong. He lowered his hand and opened a communication channel. "Human commander," he said, his voice was steady despite the fires burning on his bridge. "I am Archon Tile of the Vaith Dominion. I request terms." The reply came from Admiral Akinquo, her voice as calm as if she were ordering lunch. "Archon Tile, your fleet will power down all weapons and hold position. Any ship that fires will be destroyed. These are not terms for negotiation. Do you accept?" Tile closed his eyes. "I accept." The guns fell silent. In the hours that followed, the surviving Vaith ships powered down their weapons and submitted to human escort. The dead were counted, over 8,000 humans, and an unknown number of Vaith. The wreckage field stretched across thousands of kilometers, a vast debris cloud that would orbit Earth for decades, as a monument to what had happened. There, Archon Tile was brought to Luna Command, under guard for a formal meeting with Admiral Akinquo. They sat across a table from each other, the avian reptilian conqueror and the human admiral, and they spoke through a translation system that Zhao's team had perfected during the war. "I have a question," Tayela said. "How? Your species is young, your technology is crude, you had no experience fighting an interstellar war. How did you do this?" Akinquo looked at him for a long moment. "We have been fighting each other for 10,000 years, she said. "Simply, you are not special." Tayela was silent. Then very slowly he made a sound that the translator struggled to interpret. It was laughter. The ceasefire became a treaty. The treaty became a recognition of sovereignty, the first ever granted to a species that had been targeted by the submission pulse. The Valith Dominion, weakened by the defeat at Earth and the uprisings spreading across its territory, had no choice but to accept humanity as an equal power. But the consequences reached far beyond Earth and the Valith. The footage of the battle spread across the lattice faster than any signal in galactic history. Every conquered species saw it. Every resistance cell watched Valith ships burn and Valith shields fall, and the message that accompanied it was the same one Akinquo had sent weeks before. "We fought back, you can too." Within months the uprisings became revolutions. The Rithani declared independence. The Jellic stopped building Valith weapons and started building their own. The Uma opened the lattice to free communication for all species, breaking the Dominion's monopoly on information. Earth became the center of a new galactic coalition of free species. Delegations arrived from dozens of worlds, beings of water and stone and light and thought, all drawn to the small blue planet that had refused to kneel. They came not because humanity was the strongest or the wisest or the most advanced, but because humanity had done the one thing that mattered. It had stood up when standing up seemed impossible. Kale Marsh stood on the observation deck of the new coalition station in Earth orbit, watching ships from a dozen different species dock and depart. His shoulder still ached. He suspected it always would. Beside him, to his considerable surprise, stood Arkin. Tayela's, the former Valith commander, had been exiled by his own people for the disgrace of surrender. He had chosen to remain at Earth, serving as an intermediary between the Dominion and the Coalition, he was quiet, thoughtful, and carried his defeat with a dignity that Kale grudgingly respected. "My people have a saying," Tayelas said, watching a jelly transport glide past the viewport. "The flame that bows lives longest." Kale considered this. "We have one, too," he replied. "Do not start none. Will not be none." Tayelas turned to look at him. "That is not a very elegant saying." "No," Kale agreed, "but it is accurate." They stood together in silence, watching the ships of the new galaxy pass by. Rithani cruisers and jellied freighters, and Uma relay drones and human frigates, all moving through the same space, all free. Somewhere out across the lattice, on 1,000 different worlds, species that had lived in silence for centuries were finding their voices again. The cage was open. The lock had been broken, not by the strongest hand or the sharpest blade, but by a small, stubborn, furious species that had simply refused to accept that the cage existed. The galaxy had sent a warning shot at the wrong world, and humanity had answered.